The following is a listener-supported ministry from the Grace Evangelical Society.
We welcome you once more to Grace in Focus. Thank you for being here today as we begin looking at the Old Testament story that happens in the book of Ruth. I think you will just love how guest host Philippe Sterling breaks down this short story into episodes and scenes. He has a way of picturing the scenes such that you may perhaps even experience the story as if you were watching a movie. So today, after a little bit of background, we're going to start watching the first episode, which has 3 scenes, but we'll look at just the first scene today. And I hope that you will also take a look at our website, faithalone.org, and see the many resources and products that are there to help you understand and appreciate the free grace position, which is our position at Grace Evangelical Society. Now then, let's get into today's program, Ruth, episode number 1, scene number 1. And here is Bob Wilkin, Ken Yates, and Philippe Sterling.
Welcome to Grace in Focus. I'm here again with
Ken Yates
and Philippe Sterling.
All right, and today we're going to drop in on the subject of Philippe's master's thesis at Dallas Seminary, the book of Ruth, the introduction, and maybe the first 6 verses and a bit more if we have time. This book was written when, approximately?
Well, the book itself tells us that it's events that transpired during the time of the judges. So we're talking about the time after Joshua and the elders who lived with Joshua up until the time of Samuel. 1350 to 1050, about 300-year period. That's a time frame, and of course, that was a terrible time in Israel's history, where the people were in a cycle of believing, of faithfulness, and then falling into sin and coming under the discipline of God. And there's a number of cycles of that occurred. So the events of this book occurred towards the end of that period of time of the judges. But it's a book that is very positive. The characters in the book are very exemplary, characters, and it occurs around the little town of Bethlehem. At this pastoral setting, this insignificant town, but because of God's faithfulness towards his people and because of the faithfulness of a few of the people that are there, Boaz and Ruth among them, it has extraordinary consequences that leads to the monarchy of a good king, David, ultimately, and much beyond that, messianic implications and the birth of Christ.
The son of David.
And the descendant of Ruth, who is named by name in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. So this fascinating little book. And yet that gives us a very personal look into the lives of a couple of faithful believers in Yahweh.
So even in a time of darkness, we're seeing light here.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, by the way, what's the theme then? Now, you've already touched on it, but what's the theme of Ruth?
Well, the theme reflects on the providential arrangement of God working through the faithfulness of a very ordinary believers to bring about, a momentous event, ultimately the birth of David the king, and ultimately the birth of Christ, of the Messiah.
And all that is kind of unseen. God's hand is unseen, but you can see it through the book of Ruth that God's at work, and you said it's through faithful people.
Right. Through faithful people. So it's God's unseen hand in coordinating events, and several hints of that, strong hints of that, appear. We'll talk about it when we come to those verses. But the opening of Ruth, the first 6 verses, set a very bleak, depressing situation.
The darkness leads to the light later in the book.
Yes.
All right, let's go through the first 6 verses then.
Okay, so it's a time of the judges, and that itself, puts a depressing note. It wasn't a very good time. We might say it was a time of the Great Depression. And a famine occurs, and a famine might have been part of God's discipline on the people for their unfaithfulness. So because of famine, a family leaves Bethlehem, and they make their way to the territory of Reuben and make their way to the country of Moab. A family of 4, Elimelech and his wife Naomi and Mahlon and Chilion, their 2 sons. So sad beginning. And things get even sadder. While there in Moab, Elimelech dies. And so leaving Naomi bereft of her husband, she still has two sons. Those two sons find Moabite wives, Ruth and Orpah, and then those two sons die as well.
Wow.
So Naomi is bereft of her entire family, her husband and her two sons. But then a ray of light emerges. She hears that God has supplied bread for his people. God has visited his people, as the text tells us. Sometimes when Scripture said that God has visited his people, sometimes it's in judgment. He
Right.
visits them in judgment. Other times it's in blessing. And here it's the beginning of blessing. God has visited his people by giving them food. So Naomi decides to return back to the land that God had given Israel.
I mean, we see it in our culture as well, but particularly a widow with no husband and no children would have been in very dire straits.
Yeah.
They didn't have Social Security, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, in Moab, there would have been nothing for her. And in going back to Bethlehem, 10 years had passed. And a lot can happen even in 10 years. She didn't know what kind of welcome she would receive back in Bethlehem. She had left the land. In fact, she might have been a pariah, of sorts for having left.
Her daughters-in-law, she tries very hard
Yes.
to get them to stay in Moab, right? Because
Yes.
she thinks that's best for them.
Exactly.
For whatever reason, she thinks, go back to your people, go back to your father's household, and see what can happen.
Because she thinks it's better for them to stay in Moab than going back to
Yeah, she was thinking of their
Judah.
welfare. In fact, she's
Right.
very insistent. There's 3 cycles of dialogue, between Naomi and the daughters-in-laws. And she makes use of very strong arguments to persuade them to return back to their people.
Which works
As you
with
said.
Orpah,
Right. And
but it doesn't work with Ruth.
Right. In fact, she makes use of, as we look at the chapter, there, she makes use of national, personal, and religious arguments to try to convince them to return. So they're about ready to return. Well, Naomi is about ready to return back to Bethlehem. And there's a roadside there, I guess the major road that's going to take them back. And her 2 daughter-in-laws really loved her. Apparently Naomi had made quite an impression and had quite an influence on her 2 daughter-in-laws.
Right.
In fact, I would surmise that over the course of those 10 years, Naomi had shared, about Abraham and the promise made to Abraham that
Yes.
he will be a blessing to the nations. And I think over the course of that time that Ruth became a believer in Yahweh, believed in the coming seed, in the Messiah, was a regenerated, believer.
Yeah.
But on the roadside in Moab, they're returning, and their 2 daughter-in-laws don't want to leave. They want to go with her. But Naomi tries as hard as she can to dissuade them from that. She says, I'm an old woman. I'm not going to be able to remarry and have other sons that you could marry.
Old woman meaning what, 45 or 50? I mean, she's not that old.
No, we don't know how old but it was 10 years, and her sons, when Elimelech died, her sons were not yet married. So it's over the years after that they married Ruth and Orpah. So like I said, she may just have been 40 years old. It may still have been possible for her to conceive and bear children, but by the time they grew of marriageable age,
Right.
Ruth and Orpah will no longer have been very, for that. So she says, I'm not going to be able to provide husbands, for you. It's much better that you return to be with you people. And she does persuade Orpah of that. And Orpah just comes across as a very, ordinary, faithful, nothing unfaithful about Orpah. She was willing and wanting to go. It took 2 persuasive speeches to persuade her, to go.
Right.
To return.
And it was very logical for her to return to her homeland.
Yeah, in fact, what Ruth does is kind of illogical. Except she believes in the God of Israel. She believes in the coming Messiah. And she views herself, even though she's a Moabitess, she views herself as one of God's people, right?
Absolutely.
She has her loyalty with Israel, not with Moab.
Right. She totally identifies with Naomi and her husband's people. We learned that she was the wife of Mahlon later, who was the oldest son of Elimelech and Naomi, too. But in the third speech where she tries to dissuade Ruth, Ruth then makes this amazing statement of identification with Naomi and with God and with God's people. Let me see if I can...
Is that 16 and 17?
Yes. I'll just read it here out of the New King James. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. You people shall be my people. You, God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And there will I be buried. Yahweh, do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.
Wow.
But notice here, first of all, that she refers to Yahweh, which is an indication to me that she was a believer in Yahweh, there. But amazingly, looking at the Hebrew, it's very punctuated, statements that's there. Basically, you people, my people. You, God, my God. You die, I die.
Wow.
There, it's an amazing,
very emphatic,
statement. And what I think we may compare it to, this is not the moment that Ruth comes to faith. I think she is a believer, but what this might be comparable to might be the baptismal statements that we might make. We come to believe, and then we're baptized, identify with the church, with God's people, and in essence, make a commitment to be a disciple, of Christ. And also, I think if we were to make an equivalent to it, we might say this is her baptismal commitment, in essence, that she's making at this point. Identifying.
I'm now a Jewish woman, is basically what you're saying. I'm now a Jewish woman.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you, Philippe. That's a great, and we were able to get all the way down to verse 17, so that's great, and we'll pick up there in the next time. And until then, what are we going to do, Ken?
We are going to keep
grace in focus.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that interesting discussion. Would you like to deepen your understanding of Scripture and the Christian life? Well, a great place to start is our website. It's faithalone.org. That's faithalone.org. We've got all kinds of free materials on the site available for you. One of those, which is extremely popular, is our magazine, Grace in Focus. It comes out 6 times a year, it's full color, easy to read, and people are really growing who read it. So stop by and get a free subscription at faithalone.org. We would like to thank all of our financial partners who help us keep this show going. All gifts are tax deductible and very much appreciated. If you'd like to find out how you can be a financial partner, visit us at faithalone.org. We are so happy when we hear from listeners. Maybe you've got a question or comment or feedback. If so, please send us a message. Here's our email address. It's radio@faithalone.org. That's radio@faithalone.org. And on the next edition of Grace in Focus, we will continue the story of Ruth, and we'll look at Episode 1, Scenes 2 and 3. Listen in. You will love it. This is the Grace Evangelical Society reminding you to always keep grace in focus.
The proceeding has been a listener-supported ministry from the Grace Evangelical Society.